We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the launch of our New Data That Makes a Difference webinar series. Calgary Homeless Foundation and the University of Calgary School of Public Policy work together on research that continues to improve the lives and quality of care for those experiencing homelessness. Through this long-standing partnership, we've previously held 4 annual conferences, with the 2020 event being postponed under the direction of health and government officials. This conference is a highlight for many of us, and we're pleased that this webinar has allowed us to once again gather and highlight innovative practices in data utilization, analysis, and demonstration, and examine how data is utilized to drive impacts. In the homeless serving sector, data and research is crucial as it informs discussions and decision-making and drives our work to produce better outcomes. This is quite literally the foundation of the life-changing and life-saving results for those we serve. For those of you who are not familiar with Calgary Homeless Foundation, we work with homeless serving agencies and community partners to guide the fight to end homelessness in Calgary. We do that through collaboration and co-creation with all orders of government, public systems, homeless serving agencies, the private sector, faith-based communities, foundations, and Calgarians. Through agile systems coordination, aligned with research and data, we work to find innovative and evidence-based supportive housing solutions for people at risk of or experiencing homelessness. And over the past year, with the help of many community partners joining us today, we've helped over 2,600 people find their way home. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ron Kneebone. Ron is the Scientific Director of the Social Policy and Health Research Division in the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. He is an economist, and he hopes that that does not deter people. His published research has dealt with issues of government budgets, but he has more recently focused on issues of social assistance, poverty reduction, income inequality, and the economics of homelessness. He recently used a garden hose to fend off a moose that invaded his yard. Over to you, Ron.
Thanks, Matt. The moose is out of the yard and it's all under control. It's amazing what you learn about gardening. As Matt mentioned, I'm the Scientific Director of the School of Public Policy, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. The plan is for the speaker to use 30 minutes or so to present his thoughts on the use of data to better understand the experience of homelessness. During his presentation, you can submit questions you may have using the Q&A box that you should see on the screen. You can upvote questions that others have posed and that you would like to see the speaker answer, or you can submit your own. I will be watching the Q&A box and pose the questions to the speaker when he is finished. I may summarize and synthesize questions so that we can get through as many as possible in the time that we have. You should also see instructions in the chat box about posting questions. It is my pleasure today to introduce Brendan O'Flaherty. Dan's an economist, but as Matt said, just because you're an economist doesn't mean you're necessarily boring, though you often are. Dan is one of the exceptions. Unlike many economists, Dan is interesting and able to communicate his message in a way that is both well-grounded in rigorous analysis and in a way that can be appreciated by a non-technical audience. Dan is a professor of economics at Columbia University in New York City. He has a PhD from Harvard and has published a great deal on the economics of homelessness. I don't have time to mention even just his most influential publications, but I will mention that he has authored 2 books that have influenced my own work a great deal and which I highly recommend. One is called How to House the Homeless, and the other is Making Room, the Economics of Homelessness. Since you did not sign up to listen to me, I will stop talking and hand it over to Dan. Dan?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Christine, and thank you to the Calgary Homeless Foundation for inviting me today. I think this idea of data that make a difference is a really great idea. We think in data all the time, whether we like it or not, whether we admit it or not. I think most of you are thinking about a number like 32 degrees today. The more different kinds of data we know about and are friends with, the better we can confront the problems that we face. Today, I want to help you to get to know a couple of different kinds of data. I've found that these kinds of data are really good friends to me. And I hope you become their friends too from today's talk. So let me start sharing my screen. And okay, we're in good shape here. I'm calling it neglected data. It's some types of data that really don't get as much attention as they deserve. Okay, so there are lots of data that deal about individual characteristics of homeless people. For instance, the Everyone Counts 2018 highlights report. Lots of data about small snippets of time. These are useful. Everybody's their friends. I want to talk to you about some data that doesn't have as much, as that isn't as popular. Really just two kinds today. Given that the length of time, I'm going to talk about simple PIT, point in time counts, and about stocks and flows. I'm leaving out my first draft. I had a lot about longitudinal data and data about information, but I don't have enough time, so I'm going to have to neglect them too. I didn't intentionally want to neglect them because they are my friends too. But simple point in time counts are, you're probably very familiar with. They're the count of the number of people who are homeless in a particular area during a small period of time. Calgary is really outstanding in North America because its first point in time count was 1992, and it's been done regularly since then. The US has been doing nationally coordinated data point in time counts since 2007. They're called the AHAR. Canada attempted nationally coordinated counts in 2016 and 2018. They're still, I understand Canada is still trying in 2021. It's 61 cities in 2018 and goes by the name of Everyone Counts. The 61 cities are most of the big cities. Okay, why are these useful? Why do you want them to be your friends? When there are lots of point in time counts over time and over space, and they use about the same methods and definitions, then they get really useful. So the US numbers really became useful in around 2010, 2011 in this sense. I really hope that Everyone Counts develops the same way, so it's extremely useful in the same ways that it is. There's a chance that the US may undertake major changes in safety net and housing policy, making it somewhat more like Canada. It'll be difficult to assess these entirely in the US because everybody will be treated the same way. But adding Canada can make the research a lot better if Canada has this good data. So the US, and I think everyone, can gain from Canadian data. So far, Everyone Counts has just reported characteristics. I understand that Ron has gotten some stuff, but it's not public yet. So let me talk about the AHAR, some of the things that we've learned from the AHAR. First, in the line of gross comparisons, first, in the US, that neither the Great Recession nor the recovery from the Great Recession had a huge impact on US homelessness. We'll probably never know about COVID because there hasn't been enough research going on in COVID. The reported total homeless trends down. Reported total homelessness is going down almost the entire time since 2007, with a little bit of an increase in 18 and 19. But the first few years are probably just changes in counting practices, so I don't put much credence in them. Some other gross comparisons, some interesting stuff. is, first of all, that after the Great Recession and before COVID, the time that we really know about, homelessness in the US became very much more concentrated in big, rich superstar cities, just like wealth. Places like New York, Los Angeles, Boston, DC, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, Austin, and Seattle. Those places rose by 39% between 2010 and 2008, while the rest of the country fell by 26%. So the superstar cities went from 19% of homeless people in 2010 to 31% in 2018. And that's sort of the big story of homelessness in the US before COVID. So first question here, the polling question: was the same phenomenon occurring in Canada? This gives you a chance to answer this question. If we can get the slide up there, there we go. Google poll, time to answer if you can. In the time between the Great Recession, 2010, 2018, did Canadian homelessness follow the same pattern as in the United States and become more concentrated in big rich cities? Put yes, no, or don't know. Give some time to respond and we'll see what you guys say. I hope you can participate. It makes it more fun. And I also know what's going on. So what are our answer? A yes and a no and a don't know. Those of you who said yes, how do you know? The answer I would have given is probably don't know, because Everyone Counts doesn't publish that kind of data and doesn't go back to 2010. So let's move on. Okay, other big issue in the US and Canada is race. Here with race, I think it's important how you slice and how you compare. Having trouble advancing my slides. Okay, that did it. Got people got mad at me. So here is homeless people per 1,000 population. This is January 2020, the last available AHAR. I divided the US into the former Confederacy, 11 states in the South, and everything else. The former Confederacy is about a third of the US population, about a half of the Black population of the US. And I divided the population between Blacks, American Indians, Alaskan Natives, that's the US indigenous words, and everyone else. What you see, look at the total, is that the Blacks, the homelessness is very much concentrated on Blacks and Native Americans, and maybe a 3-4 to 1 ratio. But that hides what's going on. If you look in the two parts of the United States, the former Confederacy and everything else, separately, you see about a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio, and a 2 to 1 ratio in different places. You only get the smaller ratio, the 2 to 1, 3 to 1, by putting them together, because if the very high proportion of Blacks, almost half of Blacks, are in an area where homelessness is very low relative to the rest of the country. In the rest of the country where homelessness is quite a bit higher, you've got a much higher ratio. Another thing you can do, if you can move your slides forward, is to look at homeless people per 1,000 poor people. How much of these differences are explained by relative poverty? So this is homeless per 1,000 people in poverty. You see that part of the difference is explained by between Blacks and everyone else is explained by poverty. All of the difference between Native Americans and everyone else is explained by poverty, but there's a great deal of the difference that is not explained by poverty. And those things are that's what the work has to be done, especially what's going on outside the South and can't be explained by poverty. Hey, another question for you. Can you do anything that I just did with the publicly available data from Everyone Counts? Can you do something? We know the gross numbers in Canada that Indigenous people are heavily overrepresented, but can you do the detail that I presented for the US? Okay, yeah, you said, most people said, I wish we could. Don't know. Yes, you know, basically you can't under the current version of what's going on. And I wish and you wish that you could. That's something to think about for Canada, why you should become friends with your PIT counts and why you should look for better ones. Okay, some results from more subtle methods than just slicing and dicing. Homelessness response to housing market tightness and to warm weather as expected. That's the basic positive result. The response to most policies, including housing subsidies and permanent supportive housing, is small. It's a reduction of fewer people per 10 units. That's what you find in the PIT counts. Okay. That's why we need more consistent PIT counts and more analysis of it. The basic question that people and government officials want advocates and experts to answer is what policies reduce the PIT count substantially. Without a lot of PIT counts and without a lot of studies of that data, nobody can answer these questions, that question honestly. And right now, that's pretty much where we are. That we don't have good data on what policies do. We have some results, but not that many. And it's only PIT counts that can give you an answer about PIT counts. And the answer about PIT counts is what people in the street and government officials are looking for. Okay, my question on that. Do you agree or disagree with what I said, which is possibly controversial, that we really don't know confidently what policies are most effective at reducing PIT counts? Okay, what do we got? Okay, oh, sheep. Okay, most of you agree. That's good. So I was going to say that don't know is good, but basically no serious agreement with the idea that we don't know enough about the kind of data that only PIT counts can get. Okay, what about housing first? That was, I think many people would think about housing first. There's a great deal of data on housing first. We know that housing first works amazingly well. That homeless individuals who are randomly selected for housing first, so it's causal, are likely to spend more days housed over the next few years than homeless people who are randomly selected for usually care. This is great. This is wonderful. This is very good. But it doesn't say anything about the PIT count. We don't know whether housing first moves the PIT count because we don't know. We've never seen enough work on what happens to the PIT count when Housing First randomly starts in various places or randomly moves in other kinds of directions. Okay, why don't randomized controls like the ones for Housing First tell us? A bunch of reasons. Essentially, it's because they only look at a small piece of the possible consequences of Housing First. Is the effective treatment on the treated. They have a little box dealing with a big process. So they don't tell us what goes on outside that box. They don't tell us whether the availability of Housing First causes housing counselors to change. It doesn't tell us whether homeless people change how they act, or whether formerly homeless people who stay in Housing First stay longer than they would if they were homeless. Or maybe it's all musical chairs. They don't look at the housing market. Perhaps an apartment for one person keeps someone else from being housed. We haven't really looked at the possibilities. We don't know what's going outside this little box where you start with homeless people and you see what happens to those particular homeless people, whereas there are many, many implications that happen in a much wider world, but those do get reflected in the PIT count. Okay, I'm not saying that any of these reactions occurs. I'm not saying if it does, how big it is. I just don't know. In the absence of knowing, I don't know. So I don't know how it affects the PIT count. Okay, the closest we come is a paper by Kevin Corinth in 2017, using AHAR data, using good econometric methods. It's not a perfect paper. What he finds is he doesn't have data on Housing First. He has data on permanent supportive housing beds. He finds that 100 more housing beds results in around 10 fewer homeless people, but the confidence interval is very big. Because of that, I'm very reluctant to say that 100 Housing First beds would reduce homelessness by 100. And from what I've seen on other things, 10 doesn't seem like a bad number. It's better than most other interventions. Example, outside of homelessness, where RCTs can lead policy astray. This is domestic violence. It's a better studied example. We know the whole story here. The question is how police should act when they receive domestic violence complaints. In the 1980s, a bunch of top criminologists conducted a randomized control trial in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Domestic Violence Experiments, MDVE. When cops got a domestic violence call, they randomized and they were instructed how to respond. The experiment, random selection, showed that the best results occurred when they arrested the abuser, whether or not the victim pressed charges. So that's if there's evidence of some assault, whether or not the victim presses charges, the policy of arresting in that setting worked best, but just in that setting. Okay, so what does MDVE tell us about what police should do? What policy outside of MDVE in the real world should they perform? That police should arrest the abuser, they should try to reconcile everybody, they should randomize their responses, or it doesn't say anything about a deterministic policy directly. Hey, it doesn't say most here, hey, I'm actually making, or I'm saying things that are obvious, or I'm making a point. It doesn't say anything about the policy directly. It says really what happens when police respond randomly. It says what works given that a police officer has been called, given that someone else says that they are there and given that they are standing in a house with an abuser and a victim. So this was big news. It made a difference for policy. And many states adopted mandatory arrest laws, which said that when police respond to domestic violence and someone's hurt, they have to arrest the offender, regardless of whether the victim presses charges. Okay, but how did it work out? Along came Rada Iyengar, Rada Iyengar Plum, who is currently the Chief of Staff for the Deputy Secretary of Defense in the United States. She noticed that what MDVE looked at was only one step in a long process. So she took a step back, and instead of just looking at that one step, she looked at the results of the whole process, sort of like looking at PIT counts instead of following individuals, and she estimated the causal effect of mandatory arrest on DV homicides. Instead of decreasing DV homicides, mandatory arrest laws actually turned out to increase them. Why? What's the story? Her story is what's going on. Remember that the RCT, what happened in the Minnesota domestic violence experiment, started when the police got a 911 call. How that call was generated, whether that call was generated, was not part of the experiment. Iyengar's work suggests that the problem was that the mandatory arrest policies caused many domestic violence victims not to make those calls. And as a result of not making those calls, some of them ended up murder victims. That's why you have to look at PIT counts. You have to look at things. If you want to see what affects the PIT, you have to look at the PIT, not at the things that go on in it. You have to look at things that are a reasonable summary of the entire process. Okay, so that's why PIT counts are one of my best friends. My other really good friend in homelessness research are stocks and flows for what goes on behind the PIT numbers. Stocks and flows are technical terms that economists use and I think other people use. So stocks are point-in-time numbers like the PIT count or wealth or the depth of a lake. The time dimension is a single point. Flows are inline numbers, time inline numbers, like income, consumption. They are what goes into the stock or out of the stock. Whenever I think of stocks and flows, I think of a bathtub. The flow, there's a flow into a bathtub and a flow out. And there's the flow out comes from the drain, the flow in comes from the faucet, and there may be some evaporation. The flow and what happens, the basic bathtub identity, is that the stock at time t, the depth of the amount of water in the bathtub at time t, is the amount of the water in the bathtub a little while ago, plus the inflows, what came from the faucet, minus the outflows, what went out the drain. Notice that if the inflows are greater than the outflows for a long period of time, the bathtub overflows. If they're less, then the bathtub gets empty. So the bathtub identity tells us a lot and raises lots of questions. It's really key to how you analyze things. Okay. So first thing, from the bathtub identity, that a PIT count, which is the amount of water in the bathtub, can be relatively high either because the flow in is fast or because the flow out is slow. Slow flows out are the same as long homeless spells. So, example, let's compare New York City and Calgary before the pandemic. The New York City PIT count was around 77,000. The Calgary PIT count was around 3,000. New York City population was around 8 million. Calgary population was around 1 million. So New York City homeless population per capita was about 3 times Calgary per capita, around 9 versus around 3. So, question for you. If you randomly picked a non-homeless person in Calgary and randomly picked a non-homeless person in New York City, which person is more likely to become homeless in the next year? The person in Calgary, the person in New York City, not enough to tell, or equally likely? Okay, not enough information to tell. You guys are great. You don't need me. Why is that? I can give you the information because the stock doesn't tell you what the flow is. So the Calgary completed homeless spells around 2015 from one of Ron's papers are around 42 days. New York City homeless spells are over 400 days on average. So the rate at which people leave shelters is around 10 times as fast in Calgary as it is in New York City. Since the PIT count is only 3 times per capita, the per capita rate at which households enter shelters in Calgary is faster than the rate in NYC. Once you realize that, the distinguishing characteristic of New York City is long spells and rare entries. Prevention, and this can easily reduce budget costs in New York City. Prevention in New York City costs about $30,000. A homeless spell in New York City is a couple $100,000. Maybe not in Calgary. The numbers are going to look quite different in Calgary. Sort of the terrible thing is that you save more money by prevention in New York City, but you're dealing with the thing that isn't the big problem in New York City, which is the long lengths, and vice versa in Calgary. Looking at stocks and flows teaches you to look that way. It's very important. Los Angeles, with another huge amount, seems also to have long spells, which I don't quite understand. Come on, move. Okay, another implication is you have to keep it in mind. That's part of the story with the effect of permanent supportive housing on the count. Suppose the city adds 100 permanent supportive housing beds and everything else stays the same. In the long run, let's assume that they don't change the rate of exit from homelessness. There's no behavioral response. But if people leave permanent supportive housing slower than they would leave homelessness, if permanent and permanent supportive housing means anything, then in the long run, what permanent supportive housing does is that it reduces, or it mildly has a very mild effect on the rate of exit. Let's go to an extreme. Suppose that you forget about the algebra. Go to extreme case. Suppose that a city builds 100 permanent supportive housing beds. People enter them and they stay forever. Nothing else changes. what happens to the number of people who are homeless? Well, nothing changes the rate at which people enter. Nothing changes the rate at which people leave, because nobody's leaving to go to permanent supportive housing once the first 100 leave. So in the long run, what happens is you get no reduction in the long run amount of permanent supportive housing. Even if permanent supportive housing works precisely as hoped. You have to look at stocks and flows. You just can't ignore what's going on there and the equilibrating power of what goes on. Okay, final thing I want to talk about, if I have time, is New York City placement controversies. Again, you've got to look at things together. This is the long-running controversy in New York City about placing families, subsidizing families to move from shelters to conventional housing. So we know that New York City has this huge family shelter system where people stay for long periods of time. There's also a legal right to shelter. Since the late 1980s, the main policy that New York City has used to deal with the shelter system has been subsidizing moves to conventional housing or to public housing, which in NYC talk are placements. There is a story in New York that placements are self-defeating, that the prospect of getting subsidized housing induces many families to become homeless, so that in fact, placements make shelter population bigger, not smaller. This was rife in the 1990s. I've shown that it's wrong. A number of other researchers have shown that it's wrong, that the effect of placements on entries is pretty small, especially in the last 10 years or so. Nevertheless, the story is popular with the chatting class or chattering classes and gets dragged out whenever somebody wants to cut placements. What is the fact on these things? What's really happening is that while the placements don't make much of a difference for entries, they do make a difference for the number of families who leave shelters on their own, which when you think about it makes a lot more sense. New York City government was blind to this effect because they do not maintain any bathtub identity. Until recently, they did not keep tabs on the number of families who left on their own, so that they could not actually observe the effect on the number of families who do leave on their own. Placements are offset by reductions in the families that leave on their own, but not one for one. But it's a pretty big thing. That's what I have. You've got to look at these things. So my conclusion that PIT counts and stocks and flows are indispensable for reasonable policymaking. You can't talk about policy in a reasonable sense without looking at both of these things. The data make a difference, not by themselves. They won't give you answers unless you interrogate them carefully. You need theory. They will become your friends. They don't mind being interrogated. They love theory. Put them together with theory, interrogate them, and you'll have friends for life. And that's what I have. Let me stop screen sharing. Okay.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay.
Really interesting. I've got a lot of questions of my own. There are also questions that have been put on Q&A. Maybe I'll start with them. You make a point that the PIT count may not be responding to housing first. We place more people in housing first. It may not be. And you asked the question, is it affecting the PIT count? But the question posted was, are these necessarily the same people? When we put someone into housing first, they go through a triage process and they're chosen for presumably certain characteristics that will make them successful in housing first. People in a PIT count are much wider. They're entering homelessness for a much wider set of reasons than that. So is it necessarily reasonable to expect that the PIT count would respond to more housing first placements?
I think it does. And okay, I think that people have sold housing first in places like Los Angeles as a way of reducing the PIT count, which I don't think is legitimate. I'm not saying, I mean, I started off by saying housing first is wonderful. I know people in New Jersey that are homeless, and I am desperate to get them into housing first like situations. Um, there are differences in different professions. Okay, many people who are involved in homeless services come from helping professions, where they have a fiduciary obligation to the people that they see. If you are in a helping profession, you should be eager to have housing first. Similar things with doctors. If I go to my doctor, I want my doctor to help me, whatever the consequences are. I want my doctor, if I have COVID and I go to the doctor, I want the doctor to say, I'm going to help Dan. I don't want the doctor to start thinking like, you know, if Dan dies real quick, he won't spread the disease, which may be the case, that helping me in this case, the doctor helping me when I have COVID may in fact increase the spread of the disease. There are two different questions. So economists are not trained to have a particular obligation to anybody. And they're different questions. They are both important questions. And you can't confuse them.
Another question from the Q&A box. The questioner, and I agree with the questioner, is that I was taken by your discussion of the flows versus the stock, and whether or not we could actually, do we even need PIT counts? Should we reduce our emphasis of PIT counts and instead look at the flow data and emphasize that more?
I think we should.
Yeah.
The difficulty, especially with unsheltered people, is that it's real hard to get the flows. But with shelters, I would emphasize the flows. I mean, the PIT counts are necessary for shelters because you have to know whether the beds are filled. So they're an important management tool. But overall, I think the PIT counts are a product of the flows, and the flows are much more interesting. When people ask me about a particular city, the first thing I want to know are the flows.
But just a follow-up question. In certain cities, Calgary, for example, and there are other cities in Canada where there is very good data on shelter data. Is it a good enough proxy to replace a PIT? In other words, the number of people experiencing homelessness vary. Not everyone uses a shelter who is experiencing homelessness. But isn't it, my feeling is it's an awfully good proxy. Looking at the number of shelter users is a very good proxy for the number of people experiencing homelessness.
Not in the United States.
No.
So on PIT counts, New York City is 95% sheltered. Los Angeles is 80% unsheltered.
Oh, interesting. I can tell you, Calgary, my best guess is that the number of sheltered is about 50%. It's about 50% sheltered and unsheltered.
Yeah, and New York and in U.S. ends up about 50-50, the same way I saw in Everyone Counts, but there's a vast difference between the West Coast and everyone else.
What a question about
There's also a vast, the population of the U.S. is also spread out over a greater number of latitude.
just a follow-up question from the Q&A. Presumably this varies by ethnicity and age.
The unsheltered population in the U.S. is somewhat more white than the sheltered population. And definitely age varies. New York City, there are very few children on the street, partly because child welfare systems will not permit that.
Yeah. As you know, the Canadian data on PIT counts is pretty small. It's very recent, unlike the data from the US. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's every year PIT counts are done by, or every second year by 100 in the US.
Yeah, okay, there are 300 COCs, people get the money. If you get the money from HUD, you do a PIT count. It's every 2 years, but you're only required to do an unsheltered count every other year.
So we're way behind in Canada. We've only had one fairly comprehensive national count.
Yeah.
2018. I've been involved in some discussions about that. We want to have more of these counts, and some of the discussion has been going towards changing the content of the count, increasing the number of questions asked for people interviewed on the street. I've just wondered your view of the importance of those things versus just getting the count.
I think just getting the count. I mean, I've done the street count in New York many times. I have never been able to have any kind of conversation with a person on the street at 2 o'clock in the morning in January. And for the most part, you're doing samples. The only question that I've found remotely helpful on that sort of thing is how long have you been homeless, or did you become homeless in the last week or so? Those are theoretically helpful, but they're not reliable. And the Australian data has shown that people are not very good at retrospective questions like that.
Yeah. Another question for you. We've started relying more on by name lists in Calgary, or in Canada rather. Is there a movement in the US to use by name lists?
Yeah, and that's Community Solutions. Community Solutions is growing. Community Solutions PIT counts are quite different from the AHAR PIT counts. There's some reason to reconcile them, but I think I would trust by name counts more than a PIT count, having done the street counts in New York. I would trust almost anybody more than a New York. And Los Angeles is really bad street count. I mean, Los Angeles is a drive-by, and a drive-by count cars that you think people are living in, count tents that you think people are living in, and then we'll apply a magic number to each as people per tent at the end.
Okay, well, my my experience, at least in Calgary, is that it's much more careful than that.
Yeah, and New York is much more careful. And you would think that Calgary would be much more tempted to do a drive-by than Los Angeles, but
Why is that?
it's warmer in Los Angeles.
Oh,
On
well,
most days, not today, but most days.
I was involved. On the other hand, of course, the attraction of cold is that you get a much more accurate count. I was involved in the PIT count in Calgary some years ago when it was minus 35 degrees Celsius. And there were and the good news, of course, is that most people experiencing homelessness were indoors themselves. So there were relatively few unsheltered that were counted. So it's good and bad news about climate. Maybe, sorry, I'm just scrolling through. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on RCTs. You're pretty harsh on them. Is it mainly because they're just so hard to develop properly and design properly?
Yeah, I'm not harsh on RCTs. They are useful for what they do. For instance, the types of RCTs that are useful for overall policy, though, are not the ones that have been done. I mean, my ideal experiment on Housing First is to randomly assign Housing First beds to different cities and follow the PIT counts on those cities. So I would like to see more RCTs where it's not an individual, where the units of observation are not individuals, but are cities, because what we're interested in is cities.
Okay, so given that will never happen, because
I wouldn't count on it.
well, I'm saying I
Yeah.
suspect it would, because funding for supportive housing units are city centric.
Yeah.
And
Okay. Yeah.
likely to happen. So, given that, what would
No, I mean, they're foundations. If a foundation asked me what to do, I would say do it in some cities and do it in others.
Yeah. Okay.
And I would look. I mean, it's similar. I mean, there's the real issue where this is going to come up in Canada before any place else is on the unconditional cash transfers. So there's an RCT in British Columbia that found really good results from fairly large unconditional cash transfers. The next step will be larger RCTs on individual levels. But of course, the thing with unconditional cash transfers, what you're testing there is surprise in unconditional cash transfers. What you want to test in the long run is anticipated conditional cash transfers, how you qualify, what are, I mean, we're not going to do, it's not going to be done randomly. It's going to be, is there a procedure where you get cash? And the whole, I mean, I assuming that the unconditional work well as in the RCTs that are there, the whole challenge of unconditional cash transfers is how you administer them. And that's where you're going to need cities as the observations.
Right. Maybe just building on that, one of the questions in the box raises the issue that most of your, well, a lot of your experience has been looking at homelessness in New York City. As you know, the flow into homelessness has got a lot to do with poverty, of course, and that there's huge differences between Canada and the US when it comes to social assistance programs. I can tell you in Canada, for example, very little children who are experiencing homelessness, as in New York City, in part because, as you said, the income support system won't allow it. So it's very generous child benefits, or they're higher than usual child benefits in Canada. But there are also relatively few families experiencing homelessness in Canada because, again, the level of income support is higher. So the question is, how differently should homeless prevention efforts be in Calgary versus New York City, or in Toronto versus New York, or any Canadian city?
Way different, I think. Well, you mean the thing in New York is closer to Canada than any other place else in the US. New York still has a safety net. And there are, various things in New York. There's general assistance, there's one-shots, there are other things that are there. I mean, I think that prevention in Canada should be way different than prevention in New York. I can't imagine. There'd be some similarities, but prevention is a very difficult problem to begin with. It's a Goldilocks problem. You're not looking for people who are going to become homeless no matter what you do. And you're not looking for people who are not going to become homeless no matter what you do. So you have a just right Goldilocks group that you're looking for, which has to be also very city dependent and safety net dependent.
Yeah. So, yeah. Excellent point. Good point. We're coming up on the hour, so I'm going to maybe stop there. Just thank you very much, Dan.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. It was a
really
good
interesting discussion, and I'll hand it over to Matt.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that we can spend many hours discussing. A big thank you to our partner, School of Public Policy, for helping us make this webinar a reality, and to you, Dan, for a very thought-provoking presentation. And it's quite timely as Alberta and the rest of our partners across Canada complete this year's point in time count. Gives us a moment of pause and reflection for consideration moving forward. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to everybody for the thoughtful questions. This was very engaging and some really exciting questions that were posed, and some real thoughtful answers from Dan and Ron. It was really nice hearing the back and forth. So thank you all again to all of our community partners right across Canada that showed up today. We thank you so much. I wanted to pass it back to Dr. Nebo just for a final few comments before we end today's session.
Oh, hi. I really don't have too much to say other than to thank Dan again for his comments, and just to let him know that I feel that we're well behind in Canada in our efforts. Not our efforts are strong to try to deal with, help people experiencing homelessness. I think we are certainly behind in the effort to collect data that will help answer those questions. An exception, of course, is the Calgary Homeless Foundation, which has developed a wonderful longitudinal data set that we have exploited at the School of Public Policy. It's a fine example to other cities across Canada to try to adopt those things. So that's just a way of saying I appreciate the partnership with the Calgary Homeless Foundation in many dimensions. So I will just stop there, and again, thank Dan very much, and thank everyone for attending today's seminar. We hope to have more of these in the future. We will let you know when we figure out when we're going to do it. Have a good day, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye.